It was very much a chaotic situation, and the question of whether the revolution was actually going to succeed. The British were still in the forts on the border, and there was considerable agitation there as well. So come the Constitutional Convention, and the question then comes to how these people were going to ensure that the gains of the revolution not only continued, but that we had an independent country that wasn't going to be recolonized, but be sustained. And many people had discussed, as we've discussed the last couple of weeks, that one of the nagging, more than nagging, crucial problems that would have to be dealt with would be the slave question. I guess I have not shared my screen, so let me proceed. So I just neglected to do that, but I was going to give that introduction anyway. So here we have the Convention of 1787. And who attended that convention? Now, and what was the situation? I've gone through some of the situation. Rhode Island was not there. There were only 12 colonies there. Rhode Island was one of the 5 colonies that had already, actually 6 colonies, that had already begun the process of emancipation or abolition of slavery. Those were Pennsylvania, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. There were 55 delegates, and 25 of them, my documentation reads, held slaves. 11 were plantation owners. So more than half of those who held slaves held house slaves, which is, of course, morally bad, but is not the kind of economic commitment that we're talking about with people living on the basis of plantation slavery. So that is who was there, and they were working on the question of trying to get a national government that would maintain national unity and prosperity into the future. As concerned the issue of slavery at the convention, which is what we're thinking about, concerned about, the most prominent and vocal anti-slavery advocate was Gouverneur Morris. Now, he was a New Yorker, but he was in the Pennsylvania delegation. The size of these delegations varied greatly in the Constitutional Convention, but somehow he ended up in the Pennsylvania one. And I don't know if you are aware of this. He's the person who wrote the preamble to the Constitution. He was apparently gave more speeches than anybody else at the Constitutional Convention, and he was actually, extremely vocal against slavery. This is one of his quotes I was asked if I would read. Slavery is a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevails. Compare the free regions of the Middle States where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and happiness of the people with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and other states having slaves. The most outspoken participant on the other side was John Rutledge of South Carolina. And he was also extremely vocal. And he said, my quotes from him have to come from Madison's notes. Basically, all the quotes have to come from Madison's notes, which were done, 40 years, more than 40 years later, and of course cannot be considered a transcript, but this is probably the sense of it. So Rutledge says, in the particular discussion thing that under discussion here was the slave trade clause of the Constitution. Religion and humanity had nothing to do with this question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. The true question at present is whether the southern states shall or shall not be parties to the Union. If the northern states consult their interest, they will not oppose the increase of slaves, which will increase the commodities of which they will become the carriers. That's obviously an appeal to immediate economic self-interest. And then, if the convention thinks that North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia will ever agree to the plan, unless their right to import slaves be untouched, the expectation is vain, and the people of those states will never be such fools as to give up so important an interest. So they did. Rutledge spoke for a group that was take it or leave it, that we actually will not be part of the Union if we don't have the right to import slaves. And this set off compromise activity because it was the strong feeling of even those who were quite anti-slavery, including Gouverneur Morris, that unity was essential. The new country was surrounded by hostile imperial powers, and that if they did not hold together, then they would ultimately, very soon, be rendered into pieces. Check the Federalist Papers for those arguments. So the section of compromise, which you may be familiar with, but just to give you the exact language on the slave importation, was the Article 1, Section 9. Migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person, right? So that was the compromise that was carried out. Actually, at one point, the discussion was 1800 as opposed to 1808, but it was put back to that. The other significant compromise, which you hear a lot about today, is the 3/5 clause, although that's generally widely misrepresented as saying, in terms of understanding its significance. Its significance was that the South had the problem. They had demanded that all their people, including slaves, be counted toward their representation. But they didn't want all their people, including slaves, to be counted toward taxes. So this had actually been discussed back at the point of the Confederation. But so the question really was put on the table by the deep southern states of getting their cake and eating it too. And the compromise that came out was this, that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. So you've got those bound to service or the indentured servants, which we know there was a large proportion in the colonies throughout this immediate period for a while. So that is what was determined for that. The direct taxes, by the way, were never actually implemented. I think they made an attempt in 1798, but they did not do a direct tax on slave ownership throughout as a result of this. Now you notice, of course, there's a discussion of persons, there's a discussion of, but no discussion of slave. And there was, however, there were attempts by the South Carolinians and Georgians in particular to be explicit about talking about people in servitude or slaves. But this was explicitly turned down by the convention. And Madison himself, I mean, reflecting the fact that there was great unease, even among those who held slaves, to actually put the evil that they were doing down in writing. They were actually didn't want to do it, and those who opposed slavery on a moral basis did not want to do it. The most extreme position, in a sense, was taken by Rutledge, who didn't want the federal government to have anything to say about slavery at all, unless it was going to condone it by name in the Constitution. And of course, it did not do that, and it made this, and Madison made this point that he had said he made at the convention, that it would be wrong to admit in the Constitution that there could be property in man, that man could be property. There's a book called No Property in Man, which I highly recommend, called by Sean Willentz, which I could send you stuff about, which goes through this in great detail. Now, the person who I just wrote a blog post on, who I consider extremely enlightening on this question of the Constitution, is Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, I don't agree with him on everything that he said, but particularly because his view of the Declaration, but his view of the Constitution is highly provocative, and I want to present it to you because it was quite a surprise to me to rediscover this. I probably had read it many, many years ago. And what he thought of the compromise. In 1860, as he himself says in the speech, which I can send you the URL for, he had a different view 20 years previous, but when he first came out of slavery and was being mentored by the Garrisonites. But he decided that their outlook toward the Constitution, which was that it was a pact with the devil and the country should be broken up, was absolutely wrong. And so the arguments that he made, I want to summarize. The essence is, I, on the other hand, that is, as opposed to those who say the Constitution is an evil document, deny that the Constitution guarantees the right to hold property in man, and believe that the way to abolish slavery in America is to vote such men into power as will, I'm sorry, I misquoted that, use their powers for the abolition of slavery. And he then goes through the clause in the Constitution and his view of it. And it is quite surprising to me. The 3/5 clause, he says, well, his view is it was a downright disability laid upon the slave-holding states because it deprived them of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. If every man had been able to be represented, they would have had 2/5 more. On the slave trade, while indeed it allowed the slave trade to continue for another 20 years, he said, but nonetheless, it is anti-slavery because it looked to the abolition of slavery rather than to its perpetuity. And he asserted that at the time, people saw the abolition of the slave trade as a first step to eliminating slavery. That is obviously a controversial view these days. Others having different views, that it was basically to allow the domestic slave trade, but that was not his view, and I don't believe it was. I believe that he was correct, as was Lincoln. And then even on the most wild thing he says is on the fugitive slave provision, because as you may know, there is a clause in the Constitution which calls for those for people who have violated the law and or are bound to service. I think that's the phrase. In one state, can't be harbored in another state, but have to be returned. Now, this is the place where the South wanted to replace the terminology by saying held in servitude. That was defeated. And Douglass actually takes issue with the fact that this necessarily refers to slaves. He says literally it refers to indentured servants because they're the only ones who can make a contract to be bound to service. Slaves can't do anything. Now, what were the promises of the Constitution toward the potential ending of slavery? One of them was clearly the fact that the Congress was given the power over the slave trade. It was not the states. The Congress was allowing it to continue, the Constitution was allowing it to continue for another 20 years, but then it would make the rules about the future. The Constitution also said that it was the federal government that would make the rules about the territories belonging to the United States, and nothing shall be construed to prejudice any claims of the United States or any particular state. So that, of course, became a major issue as well around the fight over the Constitution, over slavery as we head toward the Civil War. But that was put in the Constitution as a tool. And then, of course, the Commerce Clause, the Congress having the power to regulate commerce not only with foreign nations, but also among the several states. Another total, the states might have power to continue slavery within their own borders, but not necessarily in connection with their relations with other states. And that's one of the points that Wilentz makes. He says the result of the Constitution's statements and non-statements on slavery was to leave it as a local matter, state by state, and not to enshrine it in the Constitution, but not to forbid it in the Constitution, but to provide the tools in the Constitution that could be used to eliminate it in the future. Whereas when we come toward the Civil War, the South is, and at the beginning, this view was extant as well. The view of the South was we want the right to hold slaves enshrined in the Constitution explicitly. And if you want to know what that looks like, all you need to do is look at the Confederate Constitution, which I could make available to you if you want. It's quite an enlightening document. Now, the Constitution was seen as by many in the South as a threat to the continuation of slavery because it looked forward to the end of the importation and because of the power given to the federal government. And the person who was most explicit about this was Patrick Henry, who at the ratifying convention in Virginia apparently said something even much more vulgar, with all these powers, they may free your Negroes. Henry voted against ratifying the Constitution, but it was actually done. So this was a matter of debate, discussion, and controversy at the beginning. But the key, in my view, was this to be followed up with an economic policy, which actually would also lead to the end of slavery, because slavery was introduced as an economic policy from Great Britain, and it continued as an economic policy, and you needed an alternative to move people in an opposite direction. So the key person who would have had that task was the first Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, who was the first cabinet appointment, September 1789, and who was known to be anti-slavery. He was a leading member of the Manumission Society, which we discussed last week. He had made speeches that indicated his view about this being an atrocity, and therefore, and he was a strong central government man. He wanted a national unity. He wanted national unity under an energetic government. So there you had the potential, if he could come up with a plan. Already before he's appointed, there had been a tariff law put into effect. That was one of the first legislative moves of the new Congress, and that indicated a certain direction, which is not only to generate revenue, but to protect the manufacturers of the United States. Now, that is the kind of thing that we end up seeing Hamilton push forward in a very vigorous fashion. As Hamilton's first report is to consolidate all the debts from the war, including the state debts, so that the federal government is responsible for handling those debts. And that first bill comes up in January of 1790 and is highly controversial because of its centralization of the finances of the United States. And soon after that happens, as that controversy is raging, the question of slavery is brought to the floor of the Congress by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, led at that point by Benjamin Franklin. And the petition that excerpts is here from a persuasion that equal liberty was originally the portion and is still the birthright of all men, and influenced by the strong ties of humanity and the principles of their institution, your memorialists conceive themselves bound to use all justifiable endeavors to loosen the bands of slavery and promote a general enjoyment of the blessings of freedom. Under these impressions, they will earnestly entreat your serious attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty to these unhappy men. And that is sparked tremendous acrimonious debate in the House of Representatives, and was then committed to committee and never heard of again. And in the Senate, it was simply ignored. But Franklin didn't ignore it. He responded to what was said by the pro-slavery people in the House of Representatives debate, which was led, the pro-slavery, by a fellow by the name of James Jackson from Georgia. He wrote a satire, which is fun to read, which is supposedly a discovery that he made of a speech by an Algerian divan. That's one of their potentates, I guess. and how he received a petition to end the enslavement of Christians. And he said, but if we cease our cruises, I presume means crusades, how shall we be furnished with the commodities their countries produce, and which are so necessary for us? If we forbear to make slaves of their people, who in this hot climate are to cultivate our lands? Who are to perform the common labors? And he says that this came to mind because of the arguments of James Jackson in the House of Representatives. But, this doesn't go anywhere. But Hamilton's proposals do. The assumption is carried out, and the bonded debt of the United States becomes the basis for the establishment of the first Bank of the United States, which again causes enormous objection and resentment by the southern states. There are a couple reasons for that. One reason is that the purpose of the Bank of the United States included not only providing for the debt of the credit of the United States and supporting commerce and agriculture, but also manufactures. And the South was virulently opposed to investment in manufactures. Secondly, it just increased the power of the federal government. And as Patrick Henry said, if they have this power, who knows, but that they might decide that it's to the general welfare of the United States that they get rid of slavery. Hamilton wrote a very famous report on the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, which would very much support that understanding by the southern colonies southern states that wanted slavery in perpetuity. And for all this, some of you are familiar with my book, Hamilton versus Wall Street. If you are not, I would highly recommend you get it from me if possible, in order to fill out this argument. And they had good reason to fear the promotion of manufactures, because Hamilton, at the same time he was Treasury Secretary, set up the Society for Useful Manufactures in New Jersey. Government bonded debt was also used as part of the capitalization, accepted and, if not required, I forget which, for that venture. And the purpose was to make it possible for the United States to feed itself, defend itself, and create a better life for its population without depending upon being able to getting its manufactures and all its useful finished goods from abroad, in particular from England, and becoming basically a supplier of raw materials to the workshop of the world, Great Britain. Hamilton also proceeded to promote the expansion of infrastructure around the country. This was something that would create more national unity, improve commerce, and really intrude on the plantation culture. If you are going to continue with slavery, you don't really want to expose your slaves, the enslaved, to free people, particularly people who have escaped slavery, free blacks. That would be really disruptive to their idea that they had to resign themselves to their fate. So this is one of the first infrastructure projects in the new United States, but just one of many that was begun, and many more were anticipated that didn't really come to fruition in this first decade. And the idea was also to build cities, and cities with modern capability to protect health and welfare. This is one of my favorite pictures from the early, it was not this water, this is a waterworks, right? It looks like a Greek temple, but it was a waterwork, the waterworks in Philadelphia, which was completed in the first decade of the 19th century, but was beginning to be planned initially under the Hamilton Washington administration. And then you had Hamilton's report on manufactures itself, which was an incredible tour de force to discuss how the United States could get to a position of being independent of imperial control, and be a combined agro-industrial nation. He never considered abandoning the agricultural sector. Most of the country was dependent upon and was involved in agriculture. But he never said anything here about maintaining the slave culture. And he was looking forward to creating the basis for an industrial nation, which was anathema on the other side of the divide on the slavery question. His argument and his arguments for what was required in order to become that kind of independent nation involved support for measures that were totally antithetical to the slave economy. It was necessary to have sufficient use of mechanization and technology. Well, to use technology, you've got to have a certain level of education. You've got to have a certain level of sustenance. You can't be virtually, you can't have the worst possible food, the worst possible clothes, no time to yourself, and the kind of horrendous conditions of forced labor that you had on a slave plantation. You needed to have an increase in the productive powers of labor, and that meant you had to treat your workforce in a totally different way. And you can see that the sort of summary of what you would need that I have extracted from that report involved, number one, credit, which had to be from your own country, not dependent upon other countries, such as Great Britain, which was vying and was the global controller of credit internationally still at this time, and continued that way. It's effectively through until after the Civil War. I mean, when you needed money, credit, the British banks were the place to go, and the attempt by Hamilton to set up an independent sovereign control of currency was only intermittently successful. But you needed federal support for scientific and technological advancement, mechanization to improve the productive power of your labor force, major infrastructure projects, which he said, if anything goes beyond one state, it's useful to have the federal government involved, protection of labor, i.e. tariffs or bounties or, some kind of support so that we can have our own industry in crucial areas that will not get slammed by a foreign power, and an energetic federal government with the vision to put forward its people. And the key quote, which those of you who have read the book, will recall, that in my mind makes this report unique and extremely enlightening in terms of the mind of Alexander Hamilton and his collaborators was that manufacturing should be developed, among other reasons, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise, and that is the way wealth will be promoted, and obviously your population will become happy. And Hamilton, as I said, had said decades before, over the previous decades, that slavery was the antithesis of what we needed in this country. And this, way back in 1775, does address that economic aspect as well as the moral aspect. It's fatal to morality. It also tends to debase the mind and corrupt its springs of action, relaxes the sinews of industry, clips the wings of commerce, and introduces misery and indigence in every shape. And that was exactly what he was fighting in the Report on Manufactures. So now, in this climate, there continued to be the growth of abolition societies, which had taken on a new lease on life in the 1780s. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but in George Washington's personal library were found copies of this oration, which is how it came to my attention, that was given on July 4th in 1791. And this was a powerful oration against the scourge and horrors of slavery. He says we have to eliminate the pest of slavery. It's an abomination. This was what is unique about this, or telling about this, is that it was very well received in the city of Baltimore. Now, that fact, Baltimore was in Maryland, a slave state, was known to be a center also of the slave trade, and was all the way up, you recall, all the way up to the Civil War. By the time you got to the 1830s, you couldn't give an anti-slave speech in Baltimore without expecting a mob to appear at your house, threatening life and limb. But in this case, it was back in 1791, it was extremely well received in the media, among those who read about it. No reaction formation, which, according to the person who wrote about this, and talked about this, is another supporting element of the mood at the time that the country was starting off, that it was possible to eliminate slavery. Now, of course, other things were going on. You did have in 1793 a follow-up act to try to, pushed obviously from the South, trying to put some teeth into that so-called fugitive slave section of the Constitution. And the reason that was being done is because the states which had abolished slavery or were in the process of abolishing slavery were not enforcing what was put in the Constitution, or at least not enforcing it in terms of the slave population. They were helping them escape. So here they tried to put some penalties on it, but you see that they decided that these people who were captured should go to a court and a jury trial. Well, if you're having a jury trial in Massachusetts, you very likely might be freed. If you're having a jury trial in Virginia, you might as well forget it. But this this cuts both ways, right? It cuts in terms of the hardening of those who see slavery as potentially under attack, and also a testament to the fact that the resistance was continuing. There were other significant developments on this end in 1794. The abolition societies were growing in states around the nation, including in Virginia, including in, I think, North Carolina. The New York Manumission Society instigated the convening of the American Convention for promoting the abolition of slavery, and that you can get the full minutes of those meetings. They continued on for decades afterwards, and they committed themselves to doing what they thought was possible in law and in court and in propaganda against the continuation of chattel slavery. You also did have the founding of the first independent black churches, who became a voice in the fight. And then, as I said, you had that. And then you had, well, the previous year you'd had the fugitive slave. Here you have the beginning of further moves to prohibit the slave trade. They couldn't prohibit it entirely, but they did prohibit, because of the constitutional provision, but they did prohibit American vessels from transporting slaves to any foreign country and from outfitting in American ports. So the noose was tightening around the slave trade at that particular time. This is just a picture of the writings about that convention that occurred. And here's a sense of the growth of the abolition societies. New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Connecticut, Virginia, New Jersey. Actually, there were many in some of these states. Virginia had a whole number of them in pockets, right? Which is a testament to the fact that none of these states were necessarily of a uniform view. I mean, you know that from today. There is no such thing as a solid blue or a solid red state. There were no such things as solid anti-slave and solid pro-slavery states, really. And these societies would send memorials to the Congress, they'd send memorials to their state legislatures, to try to redress the injustice and to move toward elimination of slavery. The Cutters Service, that's the National Revenue Service run by Alexander Hamilton, was commissioned to interdict the slave trade, where they could say that it was illegal, like according to that 1794 law. And very interesting to me is that Hamilton imposed a carriage tax of 1794. And this tax was also widely seen as a move against the wealthy slaveholders, because it was not to be applied to commercial vehicles, the farmers would use to take things to market and so forth, but for luxury vehicles. So some people, in what I've read recently, call it the first luxury tax. It was challenged by the South, from Virginia, as being discriminatory on the basis of a constitutional provision of having to have equal tax in every state. Hamilton himself argued it before the Supreme Court, and it was upheld. But it was another indication of moving in that direction. But
Nancy, there was a question here. There was
yes?
A question on chat.
I can't see it, so.
No, I was just going to ask Bree if she wanted to talk about it. It's just basically, what were the memorials just mentioned a couple charts ago?
Oh,
yeah, I didn't know what that meant.
oh, what a memorial is? A memorial is when a state or it's like a petition that lays out a case for certain action. The memorials, for example, would say that in our state, the free blacks are being harassed in this way and that way and the other way, and we'd like action to stop that. Or it's a means of petitioning the government for action. These days, they still go on. Memorials today are often in support of particular legislation, right? We in this local state legislature believe that Congress should enact this law to deal with this problem, right? So that's what a memorial is. Doesn't have anything to do with someone having died. I guess is what the confusion would be. So, of course, or not of course necessarily, the manufacturing perspective that Hamilton laid out in 1791 was by no means fully adopted. It was never voted on by the Congress. And the attempts to establish and expand industry were very halting and difficult. Part of that was because of the financial difficulties of just coming out of the war, the difficulties of unrest on the frontier, which was being documented to be fomented by the British who remained in the forts there, and continued economic warfare by the British. So, in fact, I read something just this week with one of the analysts on the difficulties of the manufacturing policy. Put it this way: as soon as we set up a factory, we would find a flood of cheap imports coming in from the British Isles, and people would go bust. I know I looked at it, there were a number of textile mills that were established up in New England and one in Philadelphia that, mysteriously burned down, right? So there was serious difficulty in expanding the manufacturing perspective, but most critically, despite the strong support and push of Hamilton and Washington from within the U.S. government and the state, the legislature. So what helped do that? Part of that was the ideology that Hamilton attacked in the Report on Manufactures of free trade. Adam Smith was the darling of the opposition to the U.S. having a manufacturing policy. He wasn't of that view when it came to England, but in the Wealth of Nations, he specifically said, and in his advice to rulers in Great Britain, he explicitly said that people in the colonies should not develop industry. They should depend upon those who can produce better, quicker, and he didn't say more expensive, but that is also the way it was. They should remain dependent upon us and send us their raw materials where they have advantage, and we will send them their finished goods. Now, that's the same policy that helped feed the American Revolution, of course, with the Iron Act and the Hat Act and and all that. But it's the policy of Adam Smith economics, and that was embraced by those who saw their immediate advantage being in carrying out and benefiting off that kind of trade, including the slave trade. So those who embraced that were not simply Southerners, they were also Northern merchants. Newport, Rhode Island, a very big center of the slave trade. This, of course, is early. This is 1752. It's not in the period we're talking about. But this view and sense of self-interest did continue on into the 1790s and later. And then you had Thomas Jefferson, who was in the Parliament as in the government as Secretary of State. And he was ideologically absolutely opposed to the establishment of manufactures. These quotes come from his 1782 Notes on Virginia, but he was quite adamant about them on through until very late in his life, when he said, oh yeah, of course, I never meant that we never should have manufactures. In fact, Jefferson begins to go to war against Hamilton's policy in 1791 after the bank is set into motion and after the report on manufactures is introduced. I came across yesterday something I never expected to find, which is a note that Jefferson did to himself about his agenda to what he called reduce the government to true principles. And the last item of it was condemn report of manufactures. So he says, let our workshops remain in Europe. Our interest will be to throw open the doors of commerce and knock it off all its shackles, giving perfect freedom to all people. But of course, free trade, which meant no protection for U.S. industry here, would simply mean continued domination by the British, who were the world's workshop and dominating the seas with its navy and determined to dictate terms. Now, many say that the technological invention of the cotton gin is what led to the undermining of the anti-slavery momentum that we have seen in existence. Because when we hit the 1790s, and as even was said during the convention, the soils of Virginia were getting to be really in bad shape from the tobacco and the cotton, and it was extremely tedious work, and they were not making much money off it. And then Eli Whitney establishes the gin, and everything becomes more efficient. I fail to see, it's true that allows the slaves to work more efficiently, to separate the seeds from the cotton. It does not make a case for why slave labor is more productive for the economy than free labor, which is demonstrably more productive for the economy than forcing people to work from dawn to dusk for nothing without freedom. What was also going on in the 1790s and continues all the way up to the Civil War is the direct role of British finance in the expansion of slavery, because what happens with the cotton gin and making, when it becomes more lucrative, less labor intensive to produce the cotton, is that the plantation owners decide, well, so we should expand our production of cotton, and since our soil is exhausted here, we should move to the lands to the south and to the west, which are very rich lands, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth and so on. But they needed to finance that, and the major source of finance came from the British banks, who also were, given the textile industry and the role of the textile industry in the British economy, the major purchasers of the cotton that was produced. So you had a British finance-dominated section of the economy in the expansion of the slave trade. And the British, this cohered, of course, totally with the fact that the British, like Adam Smith, were explicitly opposed to the United States becoming a manufacturing industrial nation, because that might put them in competition with Great Britain. One person who understood this quite well was Henry Clay. This, I have to admit, comes from 1824, which is out of our time frame, but it does directly nail the connection between those who were in the North and those in the South who opposed moving away from the plantation economy and toward an agro-industrial economy. And this, what Henry Clay is doing in this 1824 speech is talking specifically about protection of industry, i.e. the tariff. He says those who are opposing it are northern financiers who were connected to the British banks, by the way, and southern planters. And it's effectively, by serving British interests, they are still carrying out British colonialism. The other thing that very much impacted what happened with slavery in the 1790s was the role of the slave rebellions. And I'll just touch on this briefly. The Haitian Revolution started in 1791. It went through various phases. Some of it was quite bloody and led to a lot of refugees coming to the United States. We're familiar with that idea now. By the way, I have to make a correction of myself. I overstated by a factor of 10 how many Haitians were involved in the Battle of Savannah and the Revolution. It was 300 to 500, not 3,000. So forgive me for that, but I remembered the 3,000 from somewhere else. But anyway, Haiti, this had a big impact on just as the French Revolution had a big impact in polarizing and affecting public opinion in the United States. Now, ultimately, the person who takes over to lead the Haitian Revolution is not someone whose policy was totally different than kill the white oppressor. He was attempting to build the economy, and he reached out to the United States, specifically Alexander Hamilton, to help him come up with a constitution for the nation of Haiti. And Hamilton responded positively, and in the late 1790s, the United States, without formal diplomatic recognition, nonetheless began to carry out commerce with Haiti, and provide them with very much needed supplies. What was also going on in this period, of course, as I said, as the North became, relatively speaking, more industrialized, you had more slaves escaping to the North, and more attempts to kidnap them and take them back. This is activity that was opposed by these abolition societies, and the person who was in charge of that particular aspect in the courts in New York was Hamilton after he left the government. But that was also an aspect. At the very end of the 1790s, the New York Abolition Society was successful in passing a law for gradual abolition, making it the big prize. Unfortunately, it was so gradual that the final person was not manumitted, or was not freed until 1827. But I just cite here a oration that was given when that happened in 1827 by a man named William Hamilton, and he gave a speech crediting the Manumission Society with having carried that, with having passed the law, including General Alexander Hamilton, that excellent soldier and most able civilian and financier, and first of his profession at the bar. But that, why do I include that? Because it's Hamilton, just to underscore the Hamilton commitment against slavery and my view of its coherence with his economic policy, which called for developing of manufacturers, which is antithetical to the slave system. So just to conclude, when we hit 1800, we have a very divided country on this issue, on these economic issues, as well as the French Revolution and other matters, and race matters. But we have had a certain amount of progress. This is the census of 1800, which shows that at that point you did have, where it had been 20% in 1776 estimated, slightly lower percentage, but a significant increase in the free Black population, which will have an overall impact on the way forward. So I want to stop there. And open it up for discussion.
Marcy, I'd put a chat in.
Who did I see first? Was that you, Jack?
About communication.
Okay.
Marcy, you're not muted. You're muted.
Okay, Jack, Ree, and then who was it? Elizabeth next?
I had a question.
Oh, no, it was Dale next.
Yeah.
Jack, Ree, Dale, and then me. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, what I put in the chat was, all these things transpiring in the 1780s and 90s, et cetera. And you think about today where you have Facebook and everything, and news is traveling so fast. And here you have a colonial period where communication, I would think, must have been tremendous. Must have been tremendously difficult. How did all this information get between the players?
Well, it's interesting. When the Postal Service is set up, the Congress is given specific authorization to set up the Postal Service, right? Which is important because it sets up the roads and so forth. But the laws that are passed that set up the Postal Service are extremely pro-news. There's like very cheap or almost no tax or to send your newspapers and your newspaper subscriptions around the country. And newspapers, I mean, we were a newspaper reading country, and newspapers from then and forward, they make ours all look like comic books, right? I mean, they publish speeches from the Congress, speeches from England, policy matters. So the people and we had a relatively high literacy rate, I mean, for other countries in the world. So that's the way it was dealt with. I mean, it's sort of surprising to me sometimes how fast news spread. I mean, from one part of the country to the other, because now during the constitutional, where I know some specifics is during the fight for the ratification of the Constitution. There you have Madison in Virginia trying to get it. You had two states that were left at the end on which everything hung, New York and Virginia. And they had to try to coordinate their strategy to try to get it because they were totally outnumbered, and the pro-Constitution people were totally outnumbered in New York, and they were in a dicey situation in Virginia, considering Patrick Henry, the great orator, is against ratifying the Constitution. So what they did was, they would get horses out, they'd have riders set to go, and provide them with 3 extra horses so they could speed from one place to the other in order to communicate and coordinate the strategy between one place and the other. So it required a concerted effort, obviously, not like today where it's sort of like falling off a log to get on the internet, but it was highly valued, let's put it that way, to get crucial political information from one place to the other. And the laws of the federal government were positive toward that, and they did the best they could with the technology they had.
Alexander Hamilton, it's one of my favorite dudes. I actually saw the play with the original cast a few years ago, and it was one of the highlights of my life, which has nothing to do with this. But I had heard that he had house slaves. Is that a false rumor?
It is totally unsubstantiated. I can tell you that you should go onto my blog, and there's a very well documented refutation of the charges of that that I linked to, but there are also other articles. It's conceivable that he was involved in some transactions with slaves for his relatives, because they're in his pay book. But there is no evidence that sticks on him actually owning slaves. His will contained no slaves as property when he ended. There there's a census. The original article that was written by this woman at the Schuyler Mansion who charged this cited a census report saying Alexander Hamilton with X number of slaves. And it turned out that was an Alexander Hamilton in a different city than Alexander Hamilton was. I mean, it was ideologically motivated research. And I can only refer you to the blog, to just search on the blog for Hamilton slavery, and you will find. I think it's called, how Hamilton slavery allegations refuted, or something like that is my post. But it links to the full, very exhaustively detailed refutation of that charge.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, was Dale next? I think.
Thanks. I want to compliment you. I have just finished reading the Jefferson and Hamilton book, and it's pretty long, but the way you covered a lot of goings on in the 1790s and the things between Jefferson and Hamilton, and the way he was trying to do the bank and to bring that all into the slavery, I thought it was well done. So just a compliment to your presentation. Was very coherent, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good information.
Elizabeth, what did you want to say?
Yeah. Nancy, Elizabeth has a chat up.
Oh, no. Okay.
I send the notes through the chat, the question too.
Okay, I'll turn on my chat.
Or that I can just read them out, but it might be easier.
Okay, here we go. Where was Canada at the time? Well, trying to say. I mean, Canada got smashed when they tried to participate in the American Revolution. And in this particular period, I don't know of anything. I don't have a good idea of Canada as a whole, and I don't know that Canada was a whole at the time. It was Quebec, and then it was the other colonies to the eastern part. I have a friend who's a Canadian who's written books on it, and I've heard some of his talk, but I haven't heard. I can't. All I know is that throughout, from what he says, throughout all the way up through certainly the 19th century, there were many Canadians who wanted to join the United States. And he references citizens in British Columbia petitioning to become a state of the United States, and not being accepted, which I don't know why, right? So I don't know. Of course, people fled. Escaped slaves fled to Canada. I've read about how their treatment was not always great. And they didn't like it so cold, I guess, too, and they weren't treated, that the racism existed.
Yes.
So is there anything else?
Yeah, the other question I had was the population of this country. Was it primarily English, or what other people, from what other countries these people had immigrated to the US during that time?
During that
The time
particular
that you're talking about. I
during
mean,
the particular time I'm talking about, I don't think many people were immigrating to the United States. There were
Not
wars
yet.
all over Europe. You know, it was
Yeah.
a mess.
Right.
I don't think they were, you know, when you get into the 19th century, then you get into heavy Irish uh,
Right.
immigration, and then you get into, again, heavy German immigration,
Yes.
which you had also had in the early part of the 18th century. I mean, German heritage in the United States is extremely strong.
Was actually stronger than Irish.
Yeah,
Even in
and
the Civil
stronger than
War, and nobody ever talks about it.
English in some periods. At a certain point, I think this was 30 years ago or something like that, but there was a survey of people asking them what their country of origin was or that they identified with, and the majority was German above English. So, but when you consider that there were all these waves, right? There was a wave in the 1710s to 1730s. There was a wave after the revolution of 1848. And then there was obviously another huge wave after the Nazi period, you know. So you've, but that's all I can. But at this point, I don't think there was much immigration into the United States. The population was growing rapidly, right? You know, part of the polemic of whom we'll get into somewhat next week is of Parson Malthus was against the rapid population growth of the United States. So, because we were doubling every 25 years without massive immigration.
It was a
But
pretty
that's
small
farm life. That's
population.
partly farm life for you, I think.
Right, and it was a pretty small population, right?
In a time of not modern health and infrastructure.
We had a very small population though, didn't we? I mean, it was probably what, on the order of about 5 or 6 million?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And that's in the 1800s.
It is just interesting. Oh, sorry, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, Barbara, you're the last. You're the last, unless somebody else is. You're.
Sorry. I was just thinking about America in the early 1800s was a land of opportunity for some of my relatives who came from Scotland. And so I don't know how much this occurred, but they evidently the man of the family remarried, and the older children of the first wife didn't find favor, and 3 of them came over together, and they actually came to New Brunswick, but later came down into the United States. So I wonder if even in those days America was a land of opportunity for maybe educated people.
Not just educated. One thing that really attracted people here is that they could own land, right?
Yes.
Whereas in Europe, the feudal tradition, I mean, you couldn't always own land here. I mean, in Virginia, it was basically a feudal system and it was very difficult for people to own land. but eventually they forced reform that allowed that to happen. But if you were in Europe under a kind of serfdom, you couldn't own it, and people wanted that kind of freedom to have a little plot of their own, right? Plus the fact there was more political freedom here. There's no question about it. Just think about I mean, as you know, I'm a Hamilton aficionado, right? But it wasn't just Hamilton. I mean, throughout our history, the fight for press freedom, right? To say that you should be protected to tell the truth, even if it's inconvenient for the government authorities. And the first case, and I studied this, gosh, in the 1970s also, was the Peter Zenger case. I really encourage you, look up the Peter Zenger case in New Jersey. And now this didn't stick, right? But it was a case where someone was thrown in jail for libeling a government authority, and the jury refused to convict him because it was true what he said. And then they had to, and the court ended up ruling in his favor. So that's not going to happen certainly today. I don't even know what would happen in France. I mean, the law is much more weighted toward the institutional authorities of the caste authority of the country. Despite all the problems we have here, which are enormous problems, we have enormous problems. But when you look at where you can go to court and have a hope of getting somewhere, your chances are going to be better here than many, many other places. And it was even more true there back then, because they were closer to feudalism than we were here. So, okay, next week it's the grand finale. And I hope to see you all here.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It's very good.